I have a few disagreements with some of the supporting arguments that went into this video on unconditional surrender. First, understand that I've been watching TIK for a couple of years now. I very much, probably 90 to 95% agreement with most of what he says, and the handful of things I disagree with, I don't ultimately disagree. I essentially say, that seems possible. I just don't have enough supporting arguments for it. Now, the overall thesis of this video, I think he nailed it and I think makes sense. However, I think some of the supporting arguments that were derived from Armstrong's book uh, are a little bit tenuous. So I'm going to address some of those arguments just to see if anyone has any opinions on uh, what they may think of. If I have a good, if they think I have a good attack on those opinions or not.
First was that they had tried the whole armistice thing in 1918, and it had failed. The Allies simply didn't want to repeat the mistake of 1918, where the Germans surrendered on one set of promises that, in the end, proved impossible to the Allies to implement after the ceasefire. Wilson's 14 points and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles made the Germans believe that they had been tricked into surrendering in the First World War.
Okay, so one of my sources I'm using here is The Myth of the Great War by John Mosier. One of the things he points out, and it seems to ring true, was during World War I, the Germans believed that they were negotiating on the assumption that America was in the driver's seat in terms of ending the war. And they believe by meeting American preconditions, such as getting rid of a monarchist government and replacing it with a parliamentary government, etc., that they would get to a point where they would be able to negotiate a treaty under the 14 points of peace. I would say the Germans weren't tricked as much as they misread the power structure of World War I. And that may be because because the Americans had the answer the Germans most wanted.
German and Keynesian propaganda then made the other powers think that this was what happened, even though it hadn't, and that the Germans were guilty for the war. The Germans then used this belief to skirt around most of the punishments supposedly given to them by the Treaty of Versailles. Well, as I showed in my Weimar hyperinflation series, the Treaty of Versailles did not lead to the hyperinflation or the Nazis, because it turns out that
Okay, now I agree with most of what you're saying here. The huge question I have here is who believed what when? Okay, Keynes and others perpetuated the myth of the unjust peace of Versailles. Was this just propaganda for the masses? Was this what the intelligentsia of the West believed? Okay, my point being is most people to this day still believe that Versailles was caused by, or Versailles, the treaty thereof, caused Nazism and ultimately World War II. Who were these special breed of policymakers that existed in the years 1942 to 1945 who saw through the armistice as fake history that they were making a decision on when they came up with the idea of unconditional surrender? And really, what of it at all in terms of Churchill and Roosevelt? Okay, obviously, I agree with what you're saying that some of their advisors and policymakers were saying were advising them to go the unconditional surrender route. But considering Churchill's feelings towards the Germans, did anything that happened at the World War I armistice really guide his thinking? Okay, in terms of Roosevelt, his sole obsession was to complete what his mentor Woodrow Wilson wanted to do. He wanted the United Nations and would have accepted virtually any Soviet condition in order to secure it. In short, what you're saying about the armistice is correct. What you're saying about how it impacted the thought process of the US and British policymakers seems questionable.
A peace without victory had been tried in the First World War, and it had failed. Therefore, why would anyone assume another peace without victory would work in the Second World War?
Okay, so the peace without victory. I think when you say that, you're kind of imposing modern day beliefs on World War One mentalities. So, as you're well aware, the post Napoleonic order of Europe was a period of nearly constant war and war alarms, each ending with agreements that altered political boundaries, demanded reparations, and altered claims on various lands. For 100 years, peace without victory is the way the world ran. The idea that at the end of any war from 1816 through the end of World War I, that it would mean a lasting peace had been established and that the former combatants would never go to war with each other again, were thoughts that didn't exist at the time. In realpolitik terms, a permanently disarmed Germany that could never threaten France again was only a pipe dream of the French. Many of the countries created in the wake of World War I as part of the grand rebalancing didn't believe the French delusion. They were opportunists that would feign belief in whatever extended their existence. Summed up, peace in our time, or the war to end all wars, was just as much meaningless propaganda as Versailles was being the bad peace. The idea that we tried this before and it didn't work, so therefore unconditional surrender was the answer, kind of rings hollow. Britain and America had wholly different objectives for the post-World War II Europe environment than what they had for the post-World War I environment.
But there were other challenges. Several governments in exile were in Britain, and none of them could really agree on what a peace treaty with Germany would look like. Most of them demanded a hard solution.
Okay, so what I'm wondering here is, did the governments in exile really matter that greatly to the process? And I'm saying no. Yes, there were a fairly significant number of Free French. They were exiled Poles and all kinds of other different nationalities contributing directly to the war effort. But their opinion of whether there should be unconditional surrender or not seems pretty moot. I mean, their choice was fight the war that the Americans and British were fighting the way they wanted to fight it, or there would be no war at all. So, in terms of Soviet demands on unconditional surrender, that's absolutely, in fact, so overwhelming as to be almost the entirety of the argument, whereas the governments in exile, like Poland and France, would seem to be so minimal as to be non-existent.
So unconditional surrender not only didn't promise the Germans anything, but it bridged the gap between all the various factions. In other words, unconditional surrender was a compromise. It united everyone while the war was still going on and left the post-war policy until after the fighting had ended. That is the core element of the whole idea.
Okay, you're absolutely correct. And I believe this is the core thesis to the whole video. And unfortunately, this core thesis makes a very short video, but I think this element of it is so overwhelming that compared to the other supporting arguments, this is the elephant and the other supporting arguments are the gnats.
There are other factors too. Allied propaganda was incredibly successful in painting the enemy as evil and the source of the conflict. Since the war is viewed as a massive struggle of the forces of good against the forces of evil, no compromise is thinkable. Compromise is possible only between human beings who recognize each other as human, as mutually fallible, not between abstract forces, and most certainly not between abstract good and evil. Without
Okay, this section seems really suspect to me. Okay, so consider that in World War I, the general masses believed that the Germans were bayoneting babies and raping nuns. So I think it's really hard to believe that there's a way to quantify the anti-German propaganda from World War I and World War II, and then compare them and say that the World War II propaganda was ever so much more so that conditional surrender was acceptable in 1918 but couldn't be in 1945. To be honest, I don't think the establishment really cared what the masses thought at all about this.
If the Allies told them that their aim was to disband the German military and central government, split the country into 3 occupied districts, and that huge chunks of German territory were going to be taken from her, the German colonels might have had second thoughts.
Okay, so I'll mention the Morgenthau Plan here, and I do realize that it became public after Valkyrie. But I think the prospects of what the Allies were talking about in terms of unconditional surrender already had planted ideas that were probably par with what the Morgenthau Plan would eventually lay out in public. And since you get to occasionally steal from the finest source in the world, Wikipedia, I shall borrow from here. I think these are legitimate items I'm bringing up here. General George Marshall complained to Morgenthau that German resistance had strengthened. Hoping to get Morgenthau to relent on his plan for Germany, President Roosevelt's son-in-law, Colonel John Bottliger, who worked in the War Department, explained to Morgenthau how the American troops had to fight for 5 weeks against fierce German resistance to capture the city of Eschan, had complained to him that the Morgenthau Plan was worth 30 divisions to the Germans. Morgenthau refused to relent. Also, on December 11th, 1944, OSS operative William Donovan sent Roosevelt a telegraph message from Bern warning him of the consequences that the knowledge of the Morgenthau Plan had had on German resistance. The message was a translation of a recent article in one of the German papers. So far, the Allies have not offered the opposition any serious encouragement. On the contrary, they have again and again welded together the people of the Nazis by statement published either out of indifference or with a purpose. To take a recent example, the Morgenthau Plan gave Dr. Goebbels the best possible chance. He was able to prove to his countrymen in black and white that the enemy planned the enslavement of Germany, the conviction that Germany had nothing to expect from defeat, but oppression and exploitation still prevails, and that accounts for the fact that the Germans continue to fight. It is not a question of a regime, but of the homeland itself, and to save that, every German is bound to obey the call, whether he be not a Nazi or a member of the opposition. My point being here is that the Nazis had already, or Germans in general, had already envisioned some variant of what unconditional surrender looked like as being unpalatable. Once we have the Morgenthau Plan released, at least these particular experts seem to believe that it is having an impact on German resistance. So if the Morgenthau Plan made resistance harder, thus theoretically increasing the length of the war, why wouldn't the general idea of unconditional surrender have a similar impact?
That total eventual defeat of the Wehrmacht had become inevitable. It's these same generals that later insisted that it was the policy of unconditional surrender that made them keep fighting. Had the Allies been willing to negotiate, they said, the war could have been over perhaps 2 years sooner. It is true that these generals would, in July 1944, have been willing to accept the surrender of all territory gained by conquest, payment of reparations, plus disarmament, and a trial of war criminals. But this peace would have only been with the West alone. Kesselring, although not approached in regard to the July 1944 plot, writes that he would not have participated as long as the alternative to Hitler remained unconditional surrender. Manstein agreed, and both Guderian and Jodl gave as explicit reasons for their refusal to cooperate with the plot the alternative of unconditional surrender. This is because they wanted the war to continue in the East, and it also highlights that the Allies needed to crush the German military establishment entirely because these people just wanted to wage war. They needed to be thoroughly defeated and thrown out. Conditional surrender would have only proven them correct, and
Okay, so assuming the West had negotiated a separate peace, say 1944 or 1945 timeframe, you're making an assumption that I wouldn't make. You're assuming that the German military leadership had the same motivations as the Nazi leadership in terms of a war on Russia. And I don't think it's necessarily the case, or if they did hold similar beliefs, the idea that that somehow the Slavs were Untermenschen and that that they actually needed to occupy Ukraine and the Caucasus. Even if they did, I believe at this late stage it's pretty unlikely that most of the German military leadership, except for essentially Hitler's inner circle, would believe this. I would assume that the German military leadership would have assumed that Russia could not be negotiated with while the Western Allies were in the fight. It seems very questionable that if Germany were able to shift to a one-front war at this point, that they would have been able to take the offensive again. I think Western intelligence would have been pretty aware of this. Summary, nobody loved the Soviets. We had infiltrators in both our governments, British and US, that did. But I think the idea of the Germans continuing the war against the Soviets absent the Western Allies seems thin at best. Ultimately, I think there's a binary element to the approach in this video to the ideas of conditional and unconditional surrender. The idea that either Germany survives intact or Germany is split and forward, occupied in part by the Soviets. I think there's gray areas in between. Would have it been possible for an unconditional surrender to the West alone? If the German government were Nazi-free and could be known to be fully capable of accepting such a deal, I think that was something that could have happened. Now, mind you, that's a huge if. People like Erwin Rommel were definitely talking along the lines of, when he was talking about, in general, the idea of being able to hold Normandy, he believed that Allied logistics were going to make it impossible. It was essentially the Allied landings were going to be an inevitable win at some point. And I believe talking to the conspirators of Valkyrie, he said along the lines that it would be better to wait for the Allies to start making their advance on France. Once they were deeply embedded and it was clear that there was nothing else that could be done, then negotiations should be opened with them. To me, it sounded like he was open to the idea of, it didn't sound like he thought he could turn the front to a one-war front against the Russians and win. It sounded like that was the way out, was essentially surrendering to the Americans and the British. Now, if for some reason, let's say, you thought there was any chance at all, like if you were going to say, hey, you open up the west, you open the door to the West Front, we'll roll through, we'll occupy all of Germany up to the Polish border, and essentially we will occupy you for as long as we feel like occupying you. I think the Germans could have potentially been open to accepting such a deal. However, the problem would be is to the Western Allies, if there were any chance at all that the German government would either reject the offer or somehow make it public, they couldn't do it because of the risk of offending the Soviets was too great should the plan fall apart becoming public. Now, one of the things you mentioned is that the US failed to see the Soviets as at the same threat level as Britain. For instance, the British hoped for a cooperative conquest of Berlin and wanted a Balkans operation in order to push what would become the Iron Curtain back a ways. So because of the American position, I don't think it's possible that a conditional or an unconditional surrender to the West alone could have happened. Now, I agree with you that the conditions probably did not exist for a negotiated settlement in Europe. However, I think the existence of the unconditional policy contributed to the factors that made conditional surrender impossible. If unconditional surrender had not been open policy, it seems that it would be more likely that war could have ended earlier, with more of Western Europe in Allied rather than Soviet hands. How much more likely? It's literally impossible to speculate. There's no way to quantify it. I think the key factors here, unlike most of the items that are coming from the support you got from Armstrong, I think American and British doctrine had already been settled on the idea that Americans were going to be occupying Germany for the long haul. Americans were envisioning their idea of Pax Americana, and having a large number of troops permanently stationed in the middle of Europe would contribute to that. And the British, looking always to balance the continent, knew that the only way to balance the continent was with a large contingent of American forces sitting in the spot the Germans used to occupy. And once again, with deepest respect, I agree with your primary thesis. I'm just disagreeing with some of the supporting elements as being a little bit too tenuous. All right. Well, thank you very much for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video. Please consider smashing the like button. And if you have comments on any of the things I brought up, please talk about them in the discussion area below. If you think there's somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. And of course, please consider subscribing to my channel.